This is the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan update. We have Laura Vernon and Jake Serago with Utah Division of Water Resources.
All right, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right, show of hands, how many people in the room were here last year when we brought this plan to you for the first time? Okay. Just wondering how detailed to be in our discussions today. Did you see that, Jake? Raise your hands one more time if you heard the discussion last year. Okay, all right, very good. All right, so my name is Laura Vernon. I'm the Great Salt Lake Basin Planner with the Division of Water Resources, and I'm here with Jake Serago, and we're going to talk about the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. This is a tool that will provide water managers a way to make better informed water management decisions in the basin and ultimately provide a resilient water supply of water for Great Salt Lake and all of the uses in the basin. So with that, I wanted to first talk about why this plan is happening now and why it hasn't happened many years ago and what the challenges that we're up against are and how we're hoping to overcome them. So ensuring a resilient water supply for the Great Salt Lake Basin is challenging, as I think you have heard from Commissioners Steed and Davis, with Dr. Bowen talking about the challenges, people's perceptions and values about ensuring, or what people think about water in the basin. And so I think in order to ensure a resilient water supply, we need to tackle things from a social perspective and a technical perspective. And both of those things in a 36,000 square mile project area is super complicated. And so this is why this is being done now for the first time ever. We haven't had the gumption, I would say, maybe to tackle this issue until things kind of came to a head when the Great Salt Lake reached its lowest lake levels in 2021, 2022. So I think it would have been great. People are saying, why don't we have this tool now? Why don't we better understand how water moves throughout the basin? Who needs what water? What are the requirements for Great Salt Lake? What are the requirements for those in the Weber River Basin? Why don't we know all of this together now? And I think the answer to that is, well, it was complicated and we hadn't taken the time and initiative to look at that until, like I said, until things came to a head. And I think having this will help us be better prepared in the future when inevitably we are facing challenges in the basin. So just to highlight the complexities of this project, our project study area is 36,000 square miles. You can see all of the numerical challenges that we're facing. Bart was just mentioning that there are states surrounding us that don't think about water the way we think about water. And so getting people on the same page and talking the same language about water planning in the Great Salt Lake Basin is challenging. We have over 150,000 water rights in the Great Salt Lake Basin. Do you know when Commissioner Steed was just talking about our trip to Mono Lake, guess how many water users are in the Mono Lake, Owens Valley area? Anyone know? Show of hands? One. So we have 150,000. And so they were able to come up with some pretty great strategies to reduce to reduce water, to mitigate the impacts of the decline of Mono Lake, and then also to deal with the dust strategies in Great Salt Lake. But we have a lot more people and a lot bigger basin to tackle. And so we're throwing into all of the spatial and geographic complexities. We have 2.6 million humans living around Great Salt Lake, around the Owens Valley. Thankfully, because LADWP bought up all of the water rights, there was no way to develop along in the corridor in the Owens Valley. So there's very few people around there. We have a much different story in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And then I love that Envision Utah study just came out. I've been dying to hear the results. That's the first time I've heard of it. But the beliefs, values, and attitudes about how we should be managing water, moving water, conserving water, thinking about water in Great Salt Lake is, it varies from neighbor to neighbor and city to county. And so I think these are the challenges that when we're trying to get people to see things from a basin-wide perspective rather than just their neighborhood perspective, it's very challenging. But nonetheless, we're moving forward. This is the cover for the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan work plan, and just a bit of background on the project. In 2022, we received funding from the legislature to do a Great Salt Lake integrated water assessment, which is looking at the water supply and demand future and projected for Great Salt Lake Basin. And then right around the same time, we got funding from the Bureau of Reclamation to do a basin study, which is looking at similar issues. And so we combined both of the project funds for this into one big super plan. And no joke, the initiative, the Integrated Water Assessment Bill said you have to make a plan for the plant. Because this plan was so big, that's what we did. In November 2023, we came up with a draft work plan. We were working with Jacobs Engineering and their esteemed group of subs to develop a work plan, which was like the guidance for how we're going to tackle this big project. And so in late 2023, we came up with a work plan, finalized that in early 2024, and now we're putting the work plan to work and starting to provide the framework for a tool that will help water managers make decisions in the future. So the goal of the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan is to ensure resilient water supply for Great Salt Lake and all of the water uses in the basin. This is not a plan only for Great Salt Lake. We're here to protect and ensure the long-term stability of Great Salt Lake, but we also want to ensure that all of the water uses have adequate amount of water in the basin as well to allow for that growth that in the Envision Utah survey was just talking about, which will inevitably be happening, and we want to make sure that that we do have the adequate water supply. Okay. Tim and Brian hit on this just a little bit earlier in their presentation, but I'm working on Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan with an awesome group of people, but there are a lot of plans going on regarding Great Salt Lake right now, and I don't know if any of you, if you hear about all of these different plans and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on, who is doing what? And so this is a matrix that we put together that kind of helps address who is doing what and what the objectives of the plans are. And so you can see in this table format all of the different plans that are ongoing right now, wrapping up. The Great Salt Lake Strategic Plan is what Tim and Brian mentioned. I'm working on the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. The Comprehensive Management Plan is being revised and updated. That's being led by Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And the Water Distribution Management Plan is by the Division of Water Rights. That's looking at moving water within the lake. And then the Watershed Enhancement Trust, that's the trust that will hold the water rights once acquired for Great Salt Lake. So looking at it in another perspective, this is just a graphic of how I'm picturing all of these plans playing together. So the strategic plan is the plan to rule them all, or the ring to rule them all, like Lord of the Rings, I guess. And then under that, you have the integrated plan, which looks at the entire basin. The Watershed Enhancement Trust is really focused on the wetlands, the proximity to Great Salt Lake. And then the distribution plan is focusing on lake water, moving water in the lake. And then the comprehensive management plan focuses on the state sovereign lands, so the lands below the meander line, the ordinary high water mark that were considered navigable at statehood. So these are all of the different plans. They all have slightly different objectives, but I think we're all working together so much more closely now that these are aligned, and we do know who is doing what and how, and what the suggestions, strategies are that we're thinking to protect and preserve Great Salt Lake and the watershed. So in this 36,000 mile project area that we have for the basin plan, I think the key success to this project is going to be making sure that our partners are on board and understanding who our partners are and what their values are. And this is kind of blurry and awkward to look at. It is But I think I wanted that to be the point, is this is just the start of, this is just the start of the amount of players or partners that I think that we need to have come to the table to help us understand water in Great Salt Lake Basin. So we have water suppliers, we have state agencies, nonprofits, universities, and federal agencies, and we can't do this project and manage water effectively in the basin unless we're all together on the same page. And so this is just a stab at who our planning partners are. And I should add, if you want to become involved and be included in communications about this, like our other planning partners are, you can go to greatsaltlakebasinplan.utah.gov and ask to subscribe, and we will put you on our mailing list. But you can become one of our partners too. But okay, this is just drilling down more specifically for the basin plan. Here's the folks who are helping us drive the ship, make the decisions, and do the technical work. So again, Tim and Brian, the one group to rule them all, they're providing oversight and supervision for the basin plan. And then we have a Great Salt Lake Basin, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Division of Water Resources leading the charge. We have a Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan Steering Committee. That is some of the folks that you saw on the previous slide. It's the water agencies, industry groups, both in-lake, agricultural users up in the basin. So we have the stakeholders up in the basin, and then we have the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan Advisory Group, and that is the state and federal partners who are working on all of those different projects that I was talking about earlier, water rights, water resources, water quality, air quality, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, again, USGS. So we have all these teams providing guidance and direction as we're moving forward. One important part of the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan, I think, will be communications with the watershed councils. This was a recently created group by the legislature, and this is kind of like a clearinghouse for all water-related issues, in particular regions in the state. So every region has a watershed council, and so we hope to come to each of the West Desert Watershed Council, Weber River, Jordan River, and this is where we'll be doing the majority of communicating, maybe like a springboard for our outreach, for inquiries on what should our management strategies be that Jake's going to talk about in just a minute. How should we alter these strategies? What should the trade-offs look like? What should the trade-off analyses look like? We're going to be coming to these groups. So if you can look and find who your watershed council is, based on where you live, you can come to these meetings and get a pretty good idea of what's going on with the basin plan. And then Jake's going to talk about the technical teams that are required for each of the basins. So we need to have technical expertise in the Weber River Basin, in the Bear River Basin. We need to have industrial or M&I and ag experts all working together to create this kind of monster model that Jake, again, we'll talk about in just a second, but that's going to help us create our decision-making tool. All right, this is my last slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jake. So this is an important slide. This is what I look at every day. It's the schedule. Suggests this is a multi-year project, right? This cannot happen overnight. It's a ton of data, a ton of information, a ton of coordination. We're hoping that we can move things forward and keep things on track to conclude in 2027 as required by the legislature. And Jake's going to talk about the modeling and planning piece. That's an important part of the tool that we're creating. But then we have all of these other super cool projects that are ongoing right now as of April, when we concluded with the work plan. During the work plan, we did a gap analysis, and we said, what are the projects that need to happen in Great Salt Lake Basin to help us understand and make better decisions regarding water management in the basin? And so with the steering committee and the advisory group, we did some outreach and we came up with 125 projects that were that needed to be done, that could be answered. And through a process of elimination, ranking, we came up with these 8 projects. And these are the projects that we're focusing on to help inform management decisions. And I will hit on one of those in just a little bit after Jake's done talking, but I think based on the time, I'm not going to go into each of these in great detail, but I think one of the important parts to note here is that a lot of these projects are helping inform Brian's strategic plan and the comprehensive management plan for Great Salt Lake. So these aren't just providing, these projects aren't just providing decisions and answers for us and for water resources, but for all of those who are involved in water management in Great Salt Lake. So I'm going to let Jake talk about the meat of the basin plan, and then I'll wrap it up with a teaser on one of these projects. Because we could come back, and Dr. Perry in the room here, and all of these other people working on these projects could spend a whole day or just an hour or two talking about each of these projects. So there'll be plenty more to come over the years.
All right, thank you, Laura. Thank you to all the Salt Lake folks. They put on a really great convention, don't they? And so if you see a local government worker friend, please thank them. They're not all swamp creatures. Most of them work really hard to improve our world and don't make all that much doing it. So I really like the previous presentation by Bart and Envision Utah, talking about making the connection between water and what matters to us as people. And they said now that they've completed that study, they asked the next question, well, what do we do about it? This is really getting a big piece of that. What do we do about it? How do we get look at this big picture for how water moves and is managed throughout the Great Salt Lake Basin? These are the steps that we'll be taking and are taking in order to complete the plan. So in the last step there, you see develop an actionable plan. But before that, we need to first take a step to try to take the values and things that matter about how water is used and make those communicable into numbers and graphs and things that we can understand in order to do a trade-off analysis. And I'll talk about some more of those steps. So I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know when, and I don't know what's going on. But a really effective way of trying to understand what's going on is by building models. And so by building a model of the existing condition of the hydrology and water storage, reservoir operations, water diversions and returns, inflows to Great Salt Lake and evaporation, we can start to understand things. And we can start to get a consensus on a story which should be objective, which a lot of times we argue about. Well, it's the farmers. They're taking too much water. Well, the farmers say they've been doing things no different than they have for 150 years. If anything, they're saving more water now, so it can't be them. Well, it's the new reservoirs that were created in the last few decades in order to grow the cities. Anyway, you can talk to people all across the basin in different states, and they all understand the story a little bit different. So by understanding the existing condition, we can get that story straight, and that way we can argue about what's really worth arguing about is the values and what should be done in the future. So this complicated graphic shows how we are trying to understand the existing condition. There's these main pieces here, which are basically to understand water demand. You have multiple factors. Water supply is controlled entirely by the climate and how that climate interacts with the watershed to produce runoff and infiltrate water into the groundwater system. Then we have different sectors which use that water differently. And all of these, the water supply and the water demand are connected through the river system network. And those rivers eventually discharge into Great Salt Lake. Obviously, Colorado River is included because we import water from the Colorado River Basin into the Great Salt Lake Basin. Groundwater is a component, and so this shows how we have models of each of these segments, and they are all connected in a way. Many of these already exist, which is why we can actually do this in just a few years. Laura showed this slide, and I want to show it just to mention that we have a technical team for each one of those model areas. So those technical teams are working on their area. We have another team that's working on integrating it all together. These are some of the technical teams. So here, again, this is, Laura intentionally blurred this. We have the different teams, the different river basins. We have different water demand sectors, groundwater, hydroclimate, and some of these are existing partners. Some of them we're working with for the first time, but they're working on their respective part of the model. So I mentioned the river basin networks. This is a sort of a critical piece to it. So you have hydrology, which is the stream flow, and groundwater. Those feed into your river system, and the river system then has points where water is extracted, either for an agricultural use in which some water returns. That agricultural water user may extract water using groundwater wells. Same for municipal use, and there may be reservoirs which impound the water so that they can use it late in the summer. Eventually the water flows down into the wetland areas and open water of Great Salt Lake. And each one of these little users, you could think of Great Salt Lake as a water user, the mineral companies around the lake, the wetlands, each of them have water needs, amount of water that they consume entirely, amount of water that they return. And so these are all models. This is a model, this is a model, this is a model, these are models, and we put them all together. So I'll describe a little bit about the hydrology modeling. This is an example of how we have the watershed, the major surface water supplies of our basin and into Great Salt Lake. And they're divided up into these small grids, and each one of those grids looks like this, where it has a representation of the surface system, which may be some percentage of different types of vegetation, of impervious surfaces, and we introduce rainfall. We have other climate variables, computing evapotranspiration. There's an amount that runs off, some that infiltrates into the groundwater, and so we build this model, and it represents the real system of what happens. We have a model of Great Salt Lake too. It does a simple numerical balance of water balance and salt balance in the wetlands and in the different bays. We're working on improving the model in various ways, and this is a model that's generally used by the community at large, whether universities or the USGS. And this is not from this study, but is an example of how we can have a baseline historic, what the Great Salt Lake surface elevation of the South Arm actually looked like, and then we can invent different kinds of scenarios and see what the changes would have been historically. So by representing the existing conditions, we can get that story straight, and then we can go in and look at plausible future conditions, which we haven't seen yet, but maybe want to be prepared for. And those could involve changing climate. So in working with Utah State, University of Utah and the Bureau of Reclamation, we take these global climate models, which are built by scientists around the globe, and we find out which of those models work best for our region. And then we can look at other factors like what they project the greenhouse gas emissions will be in the future, different factors. We came up with 10 that we wanted to consider in using. And you can see here, this is showing change. The color shows the amount of change from a historical period in each of the seasons as well as annually. And so, this case right here shows a lot hotter in the winter and more precipitation in the winter as well. And we sent out a survey. We have over 500 people who are participating in this integrated plan. And we sent it to them, and we said, what are the things that you're most concerned about? You know, a lot of these are water suppliers, and they said, well, we're really concerned about if we have warmer winters and more precipitation comes as rain rather than snow, our systems aren't built for that. So we're worried about how that will happen. And so these were their greatest interests, you know, number 1, number 2, and number 9, which is maybe the most plausible future that we'll see in the next 100 years. Anyway, we could put those climates into our hydrology model, and then we get hydrographs. And this is an example from a Salt Lake City study that they did something similar, where they looked at the bold are the supply and the demand. Sorry, this is demand. This is supply and the demand. So you can see they often have this amount. They need this amount of water, but that's not in the streams. That's why they need reservoirs. And then the dashed line shows that's what they think their future demand will be. And under certain climate scenarios, that's what they think their future water supply will be. Anyway, those are the kinds of things that we can look at basin-wide. And then we can go in and we can look at things that humans can actually change. And they're things that would be really, really expensive or almost impossible politically, or maybe almost infeasible, like cost way too much. So we would never actually do it in the real world. But we can do it if we have a model of the real world, and we can experiment and say, what if we did these things, what would happen? So some of those things, they could be crazy, or they could be not crazy. And part of this planning process, we're working with real-world water users and water interests to figure out what it is that they want to see. So you can look at reducing the amount of lawns or improving lawn efficiency of outdoor irrigation. You can look at reducing water use across the basin, uniformly in all users, 1%, 25%, 50%. You can look at how the population would affect the basin and the lake, how changing cropping patterns or the types of crops, about increasing or decreasing Colorado River imports. Anyways, the list could go on really, really long. And as part of this planning effort, we'll be identifying the best, most feasible alternatives and then running them through our model to develop an actionable plan. And this is what the plan looks like. So if Laura and I, we've been talking a lot and trying to figure out, how do we explain this kind of thing? And it's like when you do a puzzle, you put a jigsaw puzzle together, but you don't have the cover. You've done that, right? Yeah, no one does that because it's, how do you do it? But if you have the cover, then you can start to strategize, and you can say, okay, you're in charge of finding the corners. Okay, you look for edge pieces, right? Maybe we're going to make little groups of the same colors. You have a vision of what you need to do. And so this plan doesn't put the puzzle together. This plan gives us a puzzle cover, which we don't have. And so why would you go on making big investments or expensive changes if you don't really know what you're building? And so by understanding the values, we can gain a future vision of what we need and what's possible. And so that's what we hope to achieve with the plan. Laura.
Great. Well, it looks like we're over time, right? So, or I have 1 minute. Okay, I have 1 minute to talk about this, this exciting project. So I mentioned that we have all of these other projects going on in addition to the modeling and planning. This one I'm just going to hit on is the M&I opportunities and costs. And we're working with Hansen, Allen, and Luce on this right now. But this is looking at, like I said, going back to helping water managers understand different components in the basin that need to be addressed so we can make better informed water management decisions. This one's looking at the costs of M&I conservation. So quantifying how much conservation has occurred How much could we possibly conserve? If everyone in the basin conserved, what would that look like? And then what are the costs of those conservation measures? So if everyone does that, how much is it going to cost homeowners? How much is it going to cost water suppliers? And is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, are we going to get enough water out of all of these conservation efforts to make it worthwhile? What is even worthwhile? We need to figure that out. And then this project will also help us update our water demand models. I think Commissioner Steed talked about the 135,000 acres of turf in the Great Salt Lake Basin. If we look at just eliminating that, or eliminating the non-functional turf, decreasing the park strips, how much water does that save us? And how much of that water could be dedicated and delivered to Great Salt Lake is what their message is. No secret, Bart hit on this too, the water that we lose outdoors in Great Salt Lake Basin is 80% of the water is lost through evaporation. So the water that you use inside your house, it usually makes it to Great Salt Lake, but the water that's evaporated outside your house doesn't. And so we'll come back with the results of this study. Is the juice worth the squeeze in the coming years? So stay tuned for that. But next, I just wanted to wrap up and say we're going to be coming around, like I said, to those watershed councils, and getting more of your thoughts and concerns about what are those trade-offs, what are those alternatives that we should be considering when we're looking at future climates and other possible scenarios of growth and development in the future. So anyway, we have a ton of work ahead of us. We've already done a ton, but we're going to keep going. So if you'd like to be involved, like I said, send an email to the address and we'll get you on board. That's it.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jake. We have about 6 minutes for questions.
The prior presentation, they mentioned that there's a new Utah water agent, Joel somebody another.
Joel Ferry.
Yeah,
Director
thank
Ferry.
you.
Mhm.
Do you know what, and I understand their task is to bring water from outside the state of Utah. Do you know anything about that?
I believe that is a component that the water czar will be looking at is bringing water from other states, but I don't know the details of that.
Thank you.
Like Rose has a question.
Thank you both. Really great, informative talk. This is a question that Commissioner Steed kind of answered earlier, but I think it relates to the nuts and bolts of this planning process too, which is kind of like how we put wetlands and riparian zones and kind of like nature into buckets when we're doing all the way from when we're doing the modeling to what the outcomes are. And the commissioner made a statement, I don't know if I heard it right, but it was something about 10% reduction across the board, including human-made wetlands. I'm just wondering, maybe that's not, please correct me if I just heard it wrong, but I'm wondering, oftentimes human-made wetlands are, maybe they're mitigation for a natural wetland that had been destroyed. And so how are we thinking about those buckets of ecosystems and where they are using water, ecosystems as water users, I guess, including wetlands as part of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem?
You want to take that? Go for it.
Okay, Rose. Well, I agree with you, and I know you love wetlands, and you love all things that wetlands produce. Not everybody loves wetlands, so I think that's a human choice to build wetlands, to divert water into wetlands, and to consume wetlands in order to get those benefits from them. And so through this planning process, we'll be exploring what options exist. One of the things that we can do is show that, but we can't make a decision about what ultimately should be done. You see, that has to be a value choice in recognizing what the trade-offs are. So if we do decrease use in those wetlands, then what's the consequence? And we can show that consequence, and generally people, I think there's a general consensus to say that's an undesirable consequence. So is there something else that we can do, to offset that?
And I think the planning tool will be able to, we'll be able to say, do you want to cut deliveries to the wetlands by 10%, by 20%, by 30%? What would that look like, and what would that mean?
Yeah, maybe a follow-up comment. It was just like, the wetlands are part of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. And so, yeah, I just wonder when some of those buckets are being decided, even at the modeling stage, it probably matters how you define a wetland. Is it a wetland or is it the Great Salt Lake body? And then when you determine something's a human-made wetland, well, why is it human-made? Was there a wetland there before? That kind of stuff. So anyway, yeah, I'll stop.
True. Very good point. Thank you, Rose.
All right, thanks everyone. Let's go enjoy lunch.